The science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. And within modern science, there's a conflict between the ideal of scientific inquiry, which is free inquiry, questioning dogmas, skepticism, empirical evidence, and so on, and the so-called scientific worldview, which is essentially the materialist philosophy, which has dominated institutional science since the late 19th century. The materialist ideology or worldview or the series of assumptions that it makes up are more or less taken for granted by scientists. You're not told about them. You're not, while you're being educated as a scientist, no one says, here are these assumptions, here's the evidence for them. They're just implicit. You absorb them by a kind of intellectual osmosis. And so, at an extra remove, does almost everybody who has a university education, or even a sixth form education. They're the basic assumptions of modern secular society. And somehow they're assumed ultimately to be the truths about nature guaranteed by science. Essentially, this worldview tells us that all reality is material or physical, that the world's a machine made out of inanimate matter, that nature is purposeless and evolution has no purpose or direction, that consciousness is nothing but the activity of the brain, and that God is simply an idea in human minds and hence in human brains. And this is the worldview which is simply taken for granted. And when I was being educated as a scientist, I accepted it completely. It was part of the package deal. If you're a scientist, this is the default position you adopt. It took me a long time to realize that this is based on a whole series of assumptions, and that I didn't realize were assumptions to start with. I just thought they were the truth. And most scientists do think they're the truth. What I'm doing in this book, The Science Delusion, is to take the 10 central dogmas of science and turn them into questions and look at them scientifically to see whether they hold up as scientific questions. What I'm doing is taking the ideal of science, which is very widely believed in, especially by non-scientists. Most scientists know that it's not really like that, but there's a kind of naive belief in science which is very widespread among followers of what one could call scientism, people who've turned science into a belief system or even a religion. And here's a clear statement of this ideal. It's treated not as an ideal but as a fact by Ricky Gervais, the comedian, who had a column in the Wall Street Journal just before Christmas in 2010, in which he explained his atheist worldview. He contrasted the superstition and dogmatism of religion with the nature of science, and he said, "Science seeks the truth, and it does not discriminate. For better or worse, it finds things out. Science is humble. It knows what it knows, and it knows what it doesn't know. It bases its conclusions and beliefs on hard evidence, evidence that is constantly updated and upgraded. It doesn't get offended when new facts come along. It embraces the body of knowledge." Well, anyone who's worked in a science lab or argued with a materialist will know that it's not quite as simple as that. But I'm going to take this ideal as the operating principle for this quest and actually look at the assumptions of science as if they are things that are open to question and evidence. The first of them is the dogma that nature is essentially mechanical. Everything in nature is essentially mechanical. And when turned into a question, this becomes, is nature mechanical? Now, it really helps to see the history of those ideas, and I'm just going to give a very brief thumbnail history of this basic proposition, because it's the most fundamental proposition in modern science. It's the central assumption that dominated modern science from the 17th century. And the scientific revolution of the 17th century was essentially the revolution that turned our view of nature into machinery. Before that, what they were rebelling against, what they were reacting against, was the view taught in the medieval universities and universally believed in Europe that nature was organic and alive, that we lived in a living universe, the living God was the God of a living world, that animals and plants were truly organisms with their own souls. The souls of plants shaped the form of the plant. The animals had souls that shaped their form, and in addition, the animal soul that underlay instinct, sensitivity, and movement. The word animal, of course, comes from the word anima, meaning soul. And humans, the human soul, shared with plants the ability to shape the body, mould the body as it developed, and maintain the health of the body. Our animal soul gave us our animal nature and instincts, which we share with the animals, the need for food, hunger, thirst, reproduction, and so forth. But the rational soul was that part of the human soul which was open to the divine and was to do with thought, reason, and that which took us beyond our mere animal nature. So that was the general belief, that we lived in a living world made up of organisms that organized themselves. And according to Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, that meant that as well as having material bodies and depending on energy, what he called the efficient cause, Aquinas and Aristotle, the moving cause, that the soul of the animals and plants contained their purpose, which drew them towards their developed form, if they were an embryo, or which underlay their instincts, and also gave them their form. It was the formal cause and the final cause of the animals and plants, and of everything in nature. What the mechanistic revolution did was said that living organisms and the whole world are not organisms with their own purposes and goals, as everyone had assumed. They were machines made up of parts, but the purposes and goals were external to the machinery. You see, what makes a machine different from an organism is that an organism has its own goals and purposes. A machine doesn't. It's made, designed, and created by human beings to fulfill human purposes. Machines have no purposes of their own. They have no designs of their own. They're designed by designers. They're made in factories. And they have no purpose except what's given to them. Even a guided missile doesn't have a purpose of its own where it's going to be guided to. That has to be programmed in. And you see the difference clearly between with a car and a horse. If you get into a car, it'll go wherever you want it to go. It has no desire of its own. A horse might, on the other hand. And so what in the 17th century scientists thought they were doing was enhancing the arguments for the existence of God. All the founding fathers of modern science, people like Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, Newton, Robert Boyle, and so on, all the founding fathers were Christians, and they believed that by saying that the universe was a machine and everything in nature was a machine, they gave God more power, because God was now that which gave everything its purpose, its goal, and its design. He was the intelligent designer of everything in nature. Previously, organisms had been seen as spontaneously organizing themselves and reproducing themselves. So God had this enhanced role. And what Descartes did as the proponent of the mechanistic theory, or mechanistic philosophy, or mechanical philosophy as it was called at the time, was to remove the souls from the whole of nature, leaving only the machinery, and placing the purposes and designs outside nature in the mind of God, in the angels, and in human minds. These were spiritual realities separate and distinct from matter. Matter was unconscious. It was organized by designs and purposes that came from outside nature, from the divine and the spiritual realm. Only humans had purposes and minds. Animals became just machines. Therefore, it was fine to vivisect them. And this way of thinking, when extrapolated way beyond anything Descartes could have imagined, leads to factory farming and modern agribusiness. So this view of nature as mechanical was at first not atheistic. In fact, it was theistic, but it created a new kind of theology, a mechanistic theology, and an image of God as an engineer, a mathematician, and in fact, a God in the image of human beings at the beginning of what became the Industrial Revolution. So God was an engineer and a mathematician. But the machine's only a metaphor. This didn't prove organisms were just machines, it assumed it. And in many ways, as we keep coming back to this in biology, it's better to think of organisms as organisms. The machine theory of life and the machine theory of nature is not something you can prove by experiment or test by, in an experimental test. It's simply an assumption. It's a metaphor. And organisms are much better metaphors for living organisms. In fact, they're not really metaphors. It's just saying what they are. And even the whole universe is best thought of as an organism rather than a machine. One of the first people to point this out very clearly was none other than David Hume, who's remembered today for his famous skepticism about religion. But Hume was equally skeptical about the mechanistic theory of nature, implying, as it did, the need for a designer and something that gave it purpose outside itself. He suggested instead of the world being a machine created by a clockwork-making God, it could have originated from something like a seed or an egg. This is what Hume said in his dialogues on natural religion. There are other parts of the universe, besides the machines of human invention, which bear still a greater resemblance to the fabric of the world, and which therefore afford a better conjecture concerning the universal origin of the system. These parts are animals and plants. The world plainly resembles more an animal or a vegetable than it does a watch or a knitting loom. And does not a plant or an animal which springs from vegetation or generation bear a stronger resemblance to the world than does any artificial machine which arises from reason and design? Well, Hume was surprisingly prescient, because the idea that the world originates from something like an egg or a seed, that it's generated, is exactly what the modern cosmology since the 1960s tells us. The Big Bang theory says the universe started very small and it's been cooling and growing ever since, and new structures have appeared within it. It's much more like a developing organism than a machine. The 19th century view of the universe as a mechanical system that was gradually running out of steam has just simply been superseded entirely by this modern cosmology. And in fact, the first proponent of the Big Bang theory, Father George Lemaitre, a Roman Catholic priest and cosmologist in the 1920s, thought of it as being like the hatching of the cosmic egg. And it is a very organic view of nature. At first, the Big Bang theory was opposed by most scientists because they thought it was a Christian conspiracy to get back a creation and hence a creator. But the evidence became overwhelming that the universe is expanding, and the Big Bang theory is now totally orthodox. So the idea that nature is mechanical is just an assumption, it's just a metaphor, and there's no reason that we should lock all our thinking into one metaphor, a metaphor that's based on projecting our modern human obsession with machinery onto the whole of nature. It makes more sense to think of nature as organic and organisms as organisms.